Canada participated in the First World War, being a part of the British Empire. It sent its soldiers to various regions of the world, primarily to Europe. But unlike the Old World, Canadians did not hear the roar of this war in their homeland. Not until a seemingly ordinary winter day on December 6, 1917. On that day, residents of the port city of Halifax became witnesses and victims of the most powerful explosion in history, horrible record of which was beaten only by an atomic bomb. The city of Halifax was founded by English settlers in the middle of the 18th century. It stands almost on the very edge of Canada, and the presence of a convenient bay made the town an important oceanic port. Until the 20th century, the city was developing dynamically, and when the World War I began, it became one of the main bases of the Royal Navy, providing supplies, troops, and weapons. Dozens of warships and various transports daily cruised in the waters of the bay, becoming an ordinary sight for 65,000 people living here. On December 3, 1917, one of those standard ships was the Norwegian transport SS Imo, which entered Halifax on its way from Netherlands to the United States. It was a standard procedure. The ship entered the Bay of Bedford for refueling. The refueling got delayed, and the departure was scheduled for the morning of December 6. On December 5, another ship arrived at the port. The French transport SS Mont Blanc, sailing from New York to Bordeaux. The vessel was also to enter the Bay of Bedford, and later, as part of an armed convoy, sail to Europe. But Mont Blanc arrived in the evening and was late. At the entrance to the port, the anti-submarine nets were raised to protect the ships standing then from German hunters. Mont Blanc stayed outside the bay overnight. On the next day, early in the morning of December 6, traffic in the port resumed. Having obtained permission to enter the sea, Imo moved from the bay towards the ocean through a narrow way between the city's banks. Despite the fact that traffic through this rather tight zone has a large number of restrictions, Imo gained high speed. The ship planned to catch up on its schedule. At the same time, Mont Blanc, which was standing in the sea, moved towards the bay to enter the convoy. At first glance, Mont Blanc was an ordinary transport vessel, 320 feet in length, almost 45 feet of width, displacement nearly 3,100 tons, nothing special except what was in its hold. 2,300 tons of highly explosive picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of pyroxylene, and about 35 tons of benzol. The cargo was very important to the army, but at that moment it actually turned the Mont Blanc into a huge floating bomb. The ship had a special status. In theory, vessels with such cargo should not have entered the bay, in fact surrounded by the city. But being outside the defense zone, they were a target for submarines, and this ban was lifted. In addition, such a vessel should have been accompanied by the Coast Guard ship, but they were all busy. It was decided to sail independently. After all, the pass was less than 20 miles, and further delays could become a problem. In the narrow part of the strait between the high sea and Bedford Bay, Mont Blanc and Imo saw each other for the first time. The Norwegian ship, having performed a maneuver to sail around the ship passing earlier, ended up on the wrong side of the strait. The two ships were now on the collision course. The crew of Mont Blanc was sailing confidently, expecting the Imo to change its course. But this did not happen. Caught at dangerous range, the two ships started performing emergency evasive maneuvers, but there was no time. Imo struck its nose into the right side of Mont Blanc, broke the hull and damaged the cargo. Benzol began to pour from the broken barrels in the hold. Trying to free itself from the impact, Imo went full reverse and the ship's nose came out of the damaged Mont Blanc. The metal structures of the ships rubbing against each other sparkled, setting the benzol to fire. The crew of Imo, thinking the collision was just a serious incident, moved away and proceeded to inspect their ship. Damage of the second ship did not seem too serious, and the small fire could quickly be extinguished by the port services. The crew of Mont Blanc knew perfectly well what this collision could have led to, and especially the fire that had started. The captain immediately gave the order to abandon ship. The fire went out of control. Attempts to float the ship were unsuccessful and staying on board was a clear suicide. The vessel, wrapped in smoke, drifted along the Narrows and eventually got stuck near one of the port piers. At the same time, the events were attracting more and more attention from residents. Firefighter ships approached the burning vessel and started their work, but quickly realized that the fire was unusually active. Soon the military ships arrived to take the Mont Blanc in tow and quickly bring it out to the sea far from the city. It seemed that the situation was about to be taken under control, but it was too late. At 9:04 a.m., the flames spread to all the contents of the ship's holds, which led to the ignition of other chemicals and detonation of the entire cargo. Mont Blanc was instantly destroyed. The temperature near it reached 5,000 degrees Celsius. The shock wave, the speed of which greatly exceeded the speed of sound, swept across the province and shook out the cities hundreds of miles from Halifax. The explosion was so powerful that it exposed the bottom of the strait, causing a tsunami about 60 feet high that covered the coast. All the ships near Mont Blanc were destroyed, and the remaining vessels further away, including Imo, were severely damaged and scattered around the neighborhood. After the first shock from the explosion passed, the survivors saw before them a completely apocalyptic picture. The port to where the Mont Blanc arrived had disappeared, and in its place was a huge column of smoke rising for several miles. And from the sky, burning and melted fragments of ships, buildings and rocks were raining down. Many parts of the city, located near the site of the explosion, were seriously damaged, and the onset of the fire turned almost the entire Halifax, plunged into total darkness, into a real hell. But the scale of the disaster was assessed only after the rescue operation. The explosion power was, according to approximate calculations, about 2.9 kilotons TNT. This is roughly 1/5 power of the atomic explosion in Hiroshima. Everything within the radius of 1.5 miles around the epicenter, a total area of about 400 acres, was completely destroyed. Nearly 2,000 people died, another 9,000 were injured. Hundreds of people who watched the fire through the windows of their homes during the explosion had their eyes injured by the glass shards. About 12,000 buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. The port, coastal plants, and Halifax districts simply ceased to exist. Rescue operation and the fight with the fire took several days, and forces from the whole province were thrown to the aid, including sailors of nearby navy ships. The investigation that followed was rather complicated. In the beginning, the Mont Blanc captain was found as guilty, as was the Imo captain. However, the verdicts were repeatedly challenged, since in the course of a large-scale investigation, many facts of violation of security rules were discovered, by the captains of both ships and by the fleet command alike. Despite the risk of an attack from the sea, Mont Blanc should not have entered the port. The Halifax explosion is considered to be the most powerful explosion of the pre-nuclear era and remains one of the most powerful in history, surpassed only after the first Trinity nuclear bomb test in 1945. For many years after the disaster, the explosion was considered a benchmark in comparisons, even in the late 1940s, during the nuclear weapons tests. This event is still considered one of the biggest disasters in the history of Canada, described in many studies, books and movies. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new videos on different interesting topics.